We're so delighted that you are speaking to us from Paris. I'm here in Buffalo, in Larkinville from my perch, looking right over at Larkin Square. Of course, we wish that we could be all outside hearing you speak. Elaine was scheduled to speak here at Larkin Square for the second time in June, and this is not a cancellation. Elaine, I hope you agree this will be a postponement, that when we can safely gather together and you're back in the United States, we would love to invite you to speak here in person.
Oh, absolutely. Tout à fait, as we say here. I'm hoping to get back with my husband to join our kids for family vacation in August. And what better time to be in Buffalo than August, September, right?
Absolutely. And it's, as people know who come to our Larkin Square events, that is the magic time here, because we can be out in the square and really enjoy, as everyone does in Buffalo, really enjoying the surroundings. So let's take a few minutes to talk about you. You have a new book that you were going to talk about this end, but I'd like to dial things back a bit and share with our listeners a little bit about your background. You are originally from Niagara Falls, and then now you're in Paris. So maybe you could give us how this happened.
Well, actually, I'm originally from Buffalo, Leslie, the west side of Buffalo. My father's food store was in Niagara Falls, and so we became identified with Niagara Falls. But I grew up on Busty Avenue, right next to the Peace Bridge, with the view of the Niagara River from our living room across Front Park, which has become glorious now in recent years. So it was a magical way to grow up.
Yes. And so how did you get from being a West Side girl to now a Parisian?
I really am a fraud, because when I went to Holy Angels Academy in North Buffalo, I took French for 2 years from a nun who I don't think had ever stepped foot in Paris. And that is the sum total of my formal training in French. But I went to Canisius College, and I was inspired by a professor who was a professor of French history, and I fell in love with the history of France, which I studied under him, and then in graduate school, and I just always wanted to move to France.
And so I know you have a history of writing with the New York Times. Maybe share a little bit about some of your professional writing background.
I have a short history in Buffalo because I worked for what was then the Buffalo Courier Express. Doug Turner, who had been the editor, was my next door neighbor. So since I babysat for his kids, he gave me a summer job as a reporter working the 2 to 11 p.m. shift, and I had to borrow my mother's car because the reason to have the job depended on having a car at my disposal. But I learned a lot of journalism there, and then when I finished college, went to New York and went to work for Newsweek magazine, and kind of worked my way up and was a beneficiary of a women's suit against the magazine for discrimination, and ended up moving to Chicago as a national correspondent, and then to Paris as a foreign correspondent when I was very, very young and green.
And then have you stayed in Paris ever since, or lived in other parts of the world?
Oh, no, not at all. I was in Paris and in Rome for Newsweek magazine, and then I decided that I wanted to, I was never going to fall in love and marry an Italian when I was living in Rome, because they all reminded me of my father, God rest his soul. So I moved back to the States to find a husband.
So then you made the switch into writing books. So I love Rue des Martyrs, and I had the privilege of, I would recommend to anyone when we can travel again, if you go to Paris, make that part of your itinerary. It was so much fun to have read the book and then walk on the street. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, what's it like now in this time of COVID-19 there? And that might tie in a little bit, I know we chatted the other day, to what you're able to still do on Rue des Martyrs.
Well, France is in a very difficult position, and I think the situation in France is probably much worse than it is certainly in Buffalo, and maybe even in New York State, because France does not want to become Italy or Spain. Now, France is a small country. It's the size of Texas. It's a very centralized country. so that it can organize the medical industry and medical facilities in a way that we really can't in the United States. Uh, for us to go out on the street in Paris, for example, we have to have a written, what they call attestation or certificate that has to be printed out every single time we go out with your name, your date of birth, your place of birth, the date that you're going out, the time that you're going out, because you can only go out for 1 hour and you have to check off one of these boxes to explain the reason why you're going out. And if you do it incorrectly, the police could stop you and fine you for being being unlawful. So either you can have the attestation and think you filled it out fine, but if you fill out, one of my neighbors checked off 2 boxes instead of 1 and got fined. And yesterday I was out on the street on the Rue des Martyrs, and there were 6 police out there, and their job was to check all of us and make sure that we had our statements.
And what do you do? What's still open on Rue des Martyrs or anywhere else in your neighborhood? What do you do for food? Maybe give us a little bit of the.
I have to tell you, even with Buffalo and the extraordinary access to food that you have, and my father's, God rest his soul, his food store is still open in Niagara Falls. We are really spoiled here on the Rue des Martyrs because the bottom of the street is zoned for artisans and mainly for food artisans, so that you have a real concentration of food stores. So in a 2-block area, you have the Italian épicerie, 5 greengrocers, because we just got a new one. 2 of them are organic, 2 butchers, the liquor store, the fish store, 2 cheese stores, and a supermarket, of course.
Very
so
nice.
Eat your heart out, because I could go out right now and buy a whole fish for dinner.
And who does the cooking in your house?
Well, it's interesting. We both do the cooking, and since my husband is now home with me, he's doing more cooking than when he was working in an office and I was writing from home. But it's really worked out pretty well. So we're eating pretty well here, I have to say.
Nice. Okay, I'd love to switch the conversation to this book, The Seine, The River That Made Paris. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book. And I know you have a forgotten chapter about Niagara Falls or the Niagara River, so maybe you could include that as well.
You're telling all my secrets, Leslie. I can't believe it. Well, when I left being staff of the New York Times, I turned to writing books, not full-time, but maybe 80% of the time. I still wrote a little bit for the New York Times and other publications. And I started with the book on what I called it, the only street in Paris, the Rue des Martyrs. And when that book came out and was published, I thought, okay, what next? And one of my friends, who's also a book editor and had edited 2 of my previous books, said to me, what makes you happy? What gets you excited? And I said, well, you know what? I really love the Seine River. And it hadn't really been written about as an entirety. We think of the Seine River, most of us, and we think of the Seine in Paris, that 8-mile stretch from one end of Paris to the other. But it's a long, long river. It's almost 500 miles long, and it goes all the way from the depths of Burgundy, where there are more cows than people, all the way to the sea at Le Havre and Honfleur. And it was a terrific adventure, but it took a lot longer than I thought, because the Rue des Martyrs is only half a mile long, and the Seine is really long. So given the fact that I'm one of those research-driven kinds of writers, it was a long but fun adventure, because my husband, who does the driving in the family, drove with me the length of the Seine back and forth a few times. Took a lot of the pictures too.
Great. All right, so what's the secret? What were you going to write about the Niagara River?
Well, I thought that since, I grew up looking at the Niagara River every day, because, we didn't have much money when we were kids, and we lived in the same house as my grandparents, all those houses and this, you and your husband, given what you've done to these miracles that you've made in downtown Buffalo. You know, a lot of people there were two flat houses, so that my grandparents lived on the first floor flat, and our family lived on the second floor flat. And my father used to look out from the front porch every day and say, "Look at this extraordinary view, and you can't buy a view like this." And because the sun would set over the Niagara River, and it's just where the Niagara River comes to Lake Erie. That's where, you know, the Peace Bridge is. And I grew up having this extraordinary kind of connection to a river, even though the Niagara River isn't really a river. It's a strait and it's very short and small. But that was my first river inspiration.
Nice.
And so I wanted to write a chapter about the Niagara River, and I wrote this whole long chapter. I spent a whole month researching it with a friend of mine who lives in Buffalo, Barbara Ireland, who used to be with Buffalo News and the New York Times. And we drove the length of the river back and forth. I talked to interviewed young people who were fishing in the river. I went on the, you know, those little stone islands in the middle of the park and all of that. And in the end, the book didn't support the chapter because it just didn't fit. But it's got a lot of magic about Buffalo. I mean, do you know that there are even, I mean, there's a connection between Buffalo and the Seine. There are even paintings about the Seine in the Albright.
I'd love to touch on the last chapter of your book, which does talk about Notre Dame. And I know when we chatted, this is a significant month as it's a one-year anniversary. Can you share about that chapter? Give us a little bit of context and your experience being here in Paris a year ago when that happened.
I actually was in New York the day that it happened, April 15th, and I literally was walking into an office building and saw CNN and saw Notre Dame in flames. And I, like everyone else in the world who had ever either visited Notre Dame or knew about Notre Dame, was in shock, and we were all mourning. And we are still continuing to mourn because it hasn't been rebuilt yet. What made it doubly interesting and challenging for me is that I learned that Notre Dame was saved by the Seine River, and my book had already been finished. It had already been printed in its first proofs that had gone out to reviewers and fact checkers. And when I found out that one boat pumped half the water that put out the fire of Notre Dame, because the infrastructure on the Ile de la Cité, the island on which Notre Dame sits, was too weak to support firefighters, I knew I had to write a last chapter. And thank the Lord, I used to be a news reporter, and I literally sat down and worked my tail off to write this chapter very, very quickly. And it basically was a chapter about how the Seine saved this incredible world icon. So that this month, April, we are celebrating the survival of Notre Dame and also recalling the tragedy of it. But miraculously, no one died in the fire, not a firefighter or not a civilian. And that, in a way, is truly a miracle.
Is the years and years of reconstruction, how is that going?
It was, according to the president, to be a 5-year process. So that is, it was to be expected that in 5 years from the time of the fire, Notre Dame would reopen. But now with the virus, all of the work inside the cathedral has had to stop. And even then, the work had only been tentatively started because so much of the foundation and the stonework had to be protected before the preliminary work could be done. So it certainly has delayed the reconstruction and renovation of the cathedral.
Thank you.
But it will survive, and it will live, and it will thrive, and we'll be there soon.
Absolutely. And again, looking forward to when we can all travel to Paris and see it for ourselves.